Of course, we have to make a comparison between the Egyptians and the Greeks, set off some of those differences that we've seen between the two cultures in terms of interior design. And what we're looking at is a couple of different ideas. So for the Egyptians, everything except the home, obviously, tends to be massive. We see massive architecture, the pyramids, the mortuary temple of Ramses II. Whereas from the Greeks, we see a scale that tends to be more moderate. In fact, they're taking human scale into account when they're sizing their architecture. And that's what we do today, incidentally. We take a house, or we design a house, around the size of a human. I'm sure you've been in houses where it just seems like the space is too big, and you say, well, that's ridiculous. Well, go into a cathedral, and you'll probably see a space that seems too big when you're there as an individual. It's simply too massive for us to really feel comfortable in. Whereas if you walk into an average home today, say a 3 or 4 bedroom home, you're going to feel comfortable because we have 8-foot ceilings based around humans that are 5 to 6 feet tall. We have doorways that are scaled to an individual person, not for grandiosity. The Egyptians will tend to stylize a lot of things, whereas the Greeks will try to be as realistic as possible. So for the Egyptians, for example, columns, you see those stylized flowers, the use of the lotus, the use of papyrus. Whereas the Greeks are going to tend to be a little more realistic in their forms. Their Corinthian columns look like they have real leaves growing out of them in the form of that acanthus at the Capitol. The Egyptians, we see some of the nicest places were actually meant for the afterlife, tombs. Whereas the Greeks will sit there and focus on the living, on temples for the living, and, well, I mean, for gods, really, but the living are the ones who are dealing with it, as well as their homes. So while they have tombs, they're not putting as much resources into them. After all, who cares? The person's dead either way. We also see that in Egypt, the temples focus on the interior. Now, that is because they're built for the god, and you have a priestly class who's going in, but the focus is in what's inside of it, really for the spirit of the god or the spirit of the person to come into. Whereas in Greece, at least in terms of decorative elements, the temples have an exterior emphasis. They're showing off to everyone else. And the Greeks are doing that for a reason, because they see the temple as an offering to the god, not a house for the god, and therefore the whole thing must be as perfect as possible, including those exterior details such as pedimental sculptures, metopes, friezes, and other elements. The columns will also be more standardized in ancient Greece. They tend to stick to the 3 columns, the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. Now, this is not surprising from a very militaristic society. We tend to not think of the Greeks as militaristic. We think of them as philosophers and great artists. But they are highly militaristic. And so the idea of small categories of things or small groups of categories makes a lot of sense. 3 central columns that we use for pretty much everything. Whereas for Egypt, it's very different. It's not a highly militaristic society. It's a highly religious society, and therefore they are focusing on creating something new and elegant every time. So it kind of gets into the type of society that we're dealing with. But remember, the Egyptians do have that influence on the Greeks, and the Greeks will have an influence on, well, pretty much every other Western society that we see.